If you like drama, passion, anger, then by golly, this is the video for you. This video is going to be full of angry comments, epic rants, fiery passion, the likes of which you're seeing right now. It's going to be more dramatic than a South Indian Tamil film. Before we begin, just hear me out because I want to get something off of my chest. I find it so annoying when people go around saying, oh, the Vikings wearing horn helmets is a myth. It's a myth. There's no evidence for it. There's no evidence. Like, people are so annoying with their evidence. Sure, we didn't find evidence of them wearing horn helmets, but that doesn't mean that they didn't have horn helmets. Like, they still could have had them. Many other cultures in Europe had horn helmets. So, the archaeological records, have we found everything? No. Maybe we just didn't find the horn helmets yet. So stop saying it's a myth. Stop saying there's no evidence for it. And, we have to seriously consider the possibility that they had horn helmets because it's not impossible. Okay, you've seen all the mental gymnastics that I just did right now. Keep all of that in mind as you go through this video. A few months ago, I published this video in which I debunked this notion that the Norse are known to have had overtone throat singing, that overtone throat singing is an established part of their culture. Basically, the point of the video was to showcase that overtone throat singing is nothing more than a modern application that is completely aesthetic. You have bands like Warjuna and Heilung who have never claimed to be making historically accurate music. They just chose overtone throat singing because they thought it would sound cool, it sounded good for their modern interpretation of older music. But unfortunately, a big chunk of the audience that listens to these wonderful musicians doesn't necessarily do their homework. They don't go and check if it's actually meant to be historically accurate. And so this myth has now taken hold in everybody's minds. Well, not everybody, but a lot of shut the fuck up. A lot of people's minds. Interestingly enough, there were many angry comments that were very, very angry. And all of them had one thing in common, which was they were horribly argued. I'm sorry. Argumenté is the French, so I'm thinking French terms. They were all very horribly argued. The argumentation was very poor. And I thought it would be an interesting exercise to actually look at these poorly argued responses and break them down, on the level of sort of looking at the sophistry, where the logical fallacies lie, where the intellectually dishonest behavior lies. Because essentially, the reason why these angry comments happened is a lot of people have a hard time accepting that throat singing is simply a myth. It's nothing more than a myth, and it has no historical evidence, because people develop an emotional attachment to those things. So that's really a theme that I want to explore in this video, how pop cultural influence can cause people to maintain belief in a myth through mental gymnastics, even in the face of evidence. The problem not being that people believe in myths, the problem being that even if you show them evidence that something is a myth, they will still find ways to convince themselves that no, it is legitimate. Now, before we get into the analysis of these angry comments, I want to just quickly go over the lack of evidence regarding throat singing for the Norse or earlier Germanic tribes. Now, a major bit of misinformation that everybody always passes around on the internet is a bit of translation that is based on a passage by Ibn Yaqub, who was an Arab traveler. A lot of people go around saying, we know they had throat singing. We say it. Arab traders said they had throat singing. Well, that's not quite exactly right. A few people are a little more accurate. They say, we are told that they growled like animals when singing, that their singing was animalistic and that it was growly and groaning. Not exactly. Now, to be fair, this translation is now largely outdated, and it is a translation based in an original translation from, I believe, 1927. I have the source, the paper that discusses the history of this translation. So there was an original German translation in 1927 that took this passage by Ibn Yaqub and translated it into something roughly like, they produce a groaning or a growling from their throats that sounds like dogs barking. And this is usually variations of this translation that is being passed around all over the internet. They growl or groan and it sounds like dogs barking. Now, the like dogs barking has always been a little strange to me, because I always hear a lot of people on the internet going, like a dog barking. There we go. What else could it be but throat singing? And I'm like, how? I never exactly got that. I mean, I get it, because the other day I was listening to Bazorik Vanchek on YouTube, and my mother, she came and she was like, son, dear son, pray tell, is there a dog in our house? For I am verily hearing the sounds of a dog. And I said unto her, oh dear mother mine, 'tis not a dog, though how can I blame you for? Verily, anybody with a working pair of eardrums will clearly, the first thing that they hear when hearing this is dog barking. But to be fair, the growling, groaning part definitely does sound like khargira, which is the lowest register of these sort of throat singing traditions. With all of that said, the problem is this translation is now mostly outdated, and the English translation is based on a French translation that is based on a German translation. So, like, something was lost in translation, basically, to quotes the first Pope of Vatican history, Scarlett Johansson. There is now a newer translation that is more up to date, that directly goes back. It is a direct translation into English from the Arabic. So we're not dealing with decades of translations based on older translations, and the wording that it gives us is, they produce a humming sound that sounds worse than dogs barking. Okay, so the point is, if we are going to extrapolate an entire vocal technique with confidence out of words that were written down, then we have to analyze those words carefully, right? You can't say, oh, you're just playing semantics now. That's exactly what it is. We have to look at it semantically. A humming sound. This changes everything, because really the main thing that we were dealing with that makes us go, okay, it could be khargira, is groaning or growling sound. Now what we have is a humming sound. So already it's much more vague and doesn't really necessarily resemble throat singing anymore or anything necessarily guttural. There's no description of it sounding guttural in any way. And the dog part, as having been mistranslated originally and as having been taken literally to mean it sounds like dogs barking, but what we're dealing with is a hyperbolic turn of phrase. It sounds so bad, it sounds worse than a dog barking. So kind of like when we say nails on a chalkboard, or, you know, she sounds like a dying cat. So basically the dog part, we can do away with it. It is not an actual acoustic description, it's just a hyperbolic turn of phrase. So the only bit of acoustic description that we are left with is a humming sound. So I stand by my words. There is no evidence for overtone throat singing to be found here. This is not evidence for overtone throat singing. It may be overtone throat singing, sure. It may also be any number of things. So in both cases, if we want to be really generous, just for the sake of being overly generous, I'm going to be more generous than I should be, less strict than I should be, let us consider that the now outdated, mostly rejected older translations are still perhaps valid. A groaning that sounds like a dog barking, it could be many things other than overtone throat singing necessarily. Many different vocal techniques could sound like that. And if we want to be more strict and academically rigorous, we have to look at the newest translation, which is a humming sound. And at this point, you're dealing with something so vague that to specifically want to pinpoint throat singing doesn't make any sense. The second piece of literary passage that people love to throw around, people always say, we know they had throat singing. Romans say they had throat singing. Roman historians describe Germanic tribes as having throat singing. And you're like, what are you talking about? What is the passage? Could you please? Because, of course, the people who say it that way, who word it that way, they never actually read the source. Now, when you look at the actual passage that they're referring to, it is a description by Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian, or even ethnographer, you could call it. And he has this book called The Tribes of Germania. And in the Tribes of Germania, in the 3rd chapter, he describes a war cry called the Baritus. And the Baritus is universally accepted as meaning a war cry. I will link to 2 different translations just for the sake of being, sort of fair. Again, with pure intellectual honesty, you read the passage, he's describing a war cry, and there's really nothing about it that gives us any reason to specifically go throat singing other than us deciding that we're looking for something to confirm throat singing, starting from a conclusion and working our way backwards, trying to interpret literary sources to support that conclusion, which is the complete antithesis to the scientific method. And this is something that I've just always found very, very fascinating, which is that whenever some people like an idea, suddenly the level of scrutiny that they apply to methodology is suddenly lowered, right? Their standards of evidence are completely lowered. They really, really, really want the Norse to have had throat singing. They see a passage that says a humming that's worse than dogs barking, and they go, that's evidence of throat singing to me. I don't see how you can disagree with that, right? They lower the standard of evidence to such a degree that it facilitates anything basically confirming what they want to be confirmed. This is a comment that one of my subscribers sent to me because somebody sort of linked my video on Norse throat singing on Reddit, and the only comment in that post is this one. What a dogshit video, honestly. I'm firmly on the fence on whether Scandinavians had any form of overtone singing. So keep this in mind. This is very, very important. There is no fence. Maybe that doesn't mean anything to you right now. It will mean something later in the video. But keep this in mind for now. It's like Chekhov's gun. It's gonna come back up at the climax of the third act of this video. Keep that. Like, take my I have this fucking eyeliner. It's not a pencil. You note it down. Keep it in mind. We're gonna come back to it. The way he goes about this. Only teenagers can interpret these sources in such way. What I love is that this person has put it in quotations. I never say that at all. At any point in the video. So already we're dealing with extremely blatant intellectual dishonesty. What I do say later in the video is that 12-year-olds love to look at a passage that says a humming that sounds worse than dogs barking, and they go, what else could it be? It must be throat singing. There's absolutely no other possibility. It's probably 14-year-old boys and 11-year-old boys who are like, no, they must have, I think we want, not only them, most of us. Only teenagers can interpret these sources in such way. However, here is who would never interpret these sources as it could mean only throat singing. Any musicologist worth their salt, any historian worth their salt, anybody who minimally understands the scientific method. Nobody who understands the scientific methodology would ever take this passage and say, throat singing, done. We have the evidence, it's there. It could mean nothing else. A valid, scientifically methodological conclusion is to say, it could mean throat singing. Sure, it is one of the many possibilities in that endless list of vocal techniques that could match this description. That I'm all for. I'm gonna give you a little short skit, okay, to represent to you what is the actual rational way to respond to this piece of evidence. Hello, Mr. Academic? Yes? Could you please tell me what this passage means? I don't fucking know. There you go. That's a proper academic way to go about it. Reeks of desperation. So clearly here the person and the people who like their comment do not agree with my assessment that it reeks of desperation, or at least with my choice of words. Now, of course, they don't go on to explain how it doesn't reek of desperation. They don't actually offer any counter-argument. Just remember, we are talking about a situation where people look at an extremely vague text. Either of the two translations, the humming is the first one that we have to consider, but imagine it's the dog barking one, like a barking dog. Is there any evidence of throat singing anywhere in Scandinavia, or in fact the entire region? Not at all whatsoever. Is there any ethnographic evidence of any form of overtone throat singing at any point in the history of Scandinavia, even as recently as 300 years ago? Not at all. Absolutely none. Are there any other literary passages that describe growling or some kind of vocal where the language would make us suspect that it could be Hargira or something? Not at all. Not whatsoever. This is literally the only piece of evidence that we're working with. But then people will say, if it is such a ridiculous thing, if it is so desperate, if it is such a ridiculous kind of logic to draw that it is deserving of being mocked and ridiculed, why then do so many people consider the possibility of throat singing? And this is an appeal to the bandwagon. If so many people think that to be the case, then why is it not? Then how can you say that it's ridiculous? Well, here's the thing. The many people who consistently draw the conclusion that it must be overtone throat singing, those aren't musicologists. There is no ethnomusicologist out there who, in their listing of known forms of overtone throat singing, considers Scandinavia as a likely possibility. No music historian has ever written in their book, it's probably part of the Scandinavians, or it's a very highly likely theory that we have to consider. There is no part of the Norse studies. This is not a hypothesis or a theory. It's a modern random idea that modern bands picked up, and now people are retroactively projecting it onto the past. That's what people don't understand. People, because there's so many people drawing this conclusion of throat singing, they're saying, well, if everybody's doing it, there must be some merit to it. But what they're missing is the only people doing this are Warjuna and Heilung fans. There's this great passage with Richard Dawkins, an outspoken atheist activist, where somebody asks him, "Sir, I have seen Jesus with my own eyes. You cannot deny that God and Jesus are real because I have seen him with my own eyes. Now, Richard Dawkins can be an asshole a lot of times, but there I think he was very, very decent. He said, "Sir, I do not doubt your sincerity. I believe that you believe to have seen Jesus. The only thing is, had you been brought up in India, you would have seen Krishna. Had you been brought up in pagan Greece, you would have seen Zeus or Jupiter. Had you been brought up in Zoroastrianism, you would have seen Ahriman or Ahura Mazda." Nobody who hasn't heard Warjuna and Hailong, who doesn't know this style of music, has ever read this passage and thought, must be overtone throat singing. The only people who do that are Warjuna and Hailong fans. Pop cultural influence, and especially emotional attachment to some of these pop cultural myths, often translates for a lot of people into a series of cognitive biases and logical fallacies in which they let go of the rigor of scientific methodology and therefore facilitate an interpretation of the historical record that supports their pop cultural fantasies. I also don't think that emotional attachment is needed, right? The person who disagrees with me, clearly they don't have an emotional attachment, but they're still under the influence of pop culture because they say, I'm on the fence as to whether the Scandinavians had throat singing or not. This is the equivalent of saying, I'm on the fence as to whether the Achaemenid Persians had throat singing. I'm on the fence as to whether the ancient Romans had throat singing. This is not a hypothesis. This is not a discussion any academics are having. It's a random idea that came out of pop culture, but the way that people are treating it in internet discussions, they're talking about it as if it's some sort of legitimate actual theory with a lot of evidence behind it. Like, you wouldn't hear anybody saying, I don't know, I'm on the fence about the Romans having throat singing. Nobody's even thinking about this possibility because that's just not something in pop culture. The fact that there are people out there who actually sincerely look at this kind of methodology and do not find it to be laughable, to be desperate, to be absolutely ridiculous, really is sort of frightening to me. Making up conversations about idealized versions of cultures. Okay, this is the part that I find really interesting. Making up conversations about idealized versions of culture. I'm making that up. I have never met anybody in my life, I mean literally nobody, who would deny that idealized versions of cultures and conversations surrounding those happens. This person is accusing me that I am making it up, that I literally have to make up conversations about idealized versions of cultures. If this is actually what this person is saying, if this person actually believes that pop culture and myths play no part in how we interpret the historical sources, that we do not project our pop cultural expectations that are not historical into history, if that's actually what they're saying here, the only question that I would have for them is, I would ask them to give me the dimensions of the rock they're living under in terms of fucking light years. Because of all the cultures that you could possibly deny the factor of pop culture for, the last one you can possibly do it for is the Norse. They might be by far the most stereotypically mythologized, idealized culture in the world. He's basically fighting conjecture with conjecture, saying that literary descriptions can mean anything, and then contradicting himself that it's impossible for them to mean what some people interpret them as. The whole dog thing, horrible video. At no point in the video do I ever say that it's impossible for it to mean overtone throat singing. In fact, a few seconds after addressing the dog things, literally 3 or 4 seconds, I say this. Could it mean throat singing? Sure, it could. I'm not saying that it could not be applicable to throat singing. What I'm saying is, it could be goddamn anything. He says literary descriptions can mean anything. Again, twisting the words to make them seem worse than they are. I never say at any point in the video, literary descriptions can mean anything. I believe that this specific literary passage can mean anything. A specific passage that I will remind you, all that it gives us in acoustic descriptive terms is a hum. I always say this about these discussions when you're dealing with intellectually dishonest people. You take what you originally said, and then take how they disfigured what you have said. Take the gap between the two realities. The size of that gap is the size of their dishonesty. He's basically fighting conjecture with conjecture. Again, extremely manipulative language, because the language is implying, making it seem as if My methodology is no different than the one that I'm criticizing. The one that I'm criticizing says a hum must be throat singing, or alternatively, to be very generous and use the outdated translations, a growling that sounds like dogs barking must be overtone throat singing, can't be anything else. My methodology is technically also conjecture, because you can only do conjecture. When you have a piece of text as vague as a fucking hum, all you can do is conjecture. But then there's good conjecture and there's bad conjecture. Bad conjecture is saying, must be throat singing. Why? What else could it be? And the only reason they're saying that, again, is pop culture. A more wise form of conjecture is that which a lot of people did in the comments of my video, which is, maybe it's this, maybe it could also be that, maybe it could also be that. And then you just create a list of everything that it could be. And you just go with that. You just go with the conjecture that it could be any of those things. And so me giving examples of other alternative possibilities that are as valid as throat singing, he just takes away all this nuance and manipulates the language into he's just fighting conjecture with conjecture. He's a hypocrite. He's doing the exact same thing. The reason why I'm talking about all of this is because these internet spaces are where a vast majority of the people around the world get their information on historical cultures. Everybody is not as privileged as I was to have an academic education in history. But the problem is academia doesn't just work because all the facts are there and you go there and you learn all the facts. Discussion is an important part of it. Fruitful, healthy discussions where you actually listen to what the other person has to say. You don't misconstrue their arguments. You don't just get angry, completely twisting the words, completely changing what I say, straw man arguments, responding to things I haven't said. It's a shame. Reddit, YouTube, etc. They can be spaces where fruitful discussions about the historical past can happen, but as long as it will be very difficult to turn the internet into a place where fruitful understanding of the historical past can happen, because that comes through discussion. And as of now, the quality of discussion on the internet is very low, unfortunately. There's also this argument that I really want to sort of go over, which I think is a horrible argument. A lot of people say, well, you know, the
Mongols,
they were pagans and shamanistic, and the Norse were kind of pagan and shamanistic. So if you have one pagan culture with throat singing, why couldn't the Norse have had it? Because throat singing is a pagan thing. If you believe throat singing to equal paganism, you're welcome to go to Sardinia, where they have canto a tenore, which is a form of overtone throat singing. You know what else is pagan singing? Christian chants. Byzantine chant and Catholic chants, musicologically, they grew out of the music theory and the musical practices of pagan antiquity. You know, the styles of chanting of the early Old Roman chant, these were not invented wholesale with an entire new form of music theory and stylistic behaviors with the advent of Christianity. If you listen to the earliest Christian hymns, they are indistinguishable musicologically from the rest of the music of the pagan world. The only thing that makes Christian music Christian is the theme, it's the lyrics, it's the thematic, but musicologically there is no distinction between pagan music of antiquity, of late antiquity, and Christian music of late antiquity. They're one and the same. Nowadays people have this idea that paganism is this concrete set of recognizable features that is mostly weird furs and people growling and convulsing on the ground and their eyes are going up their sockets like this. You know, there's a specific aesthetic nowadays that people think equals paganism. You know, you're talking about, well, the Mongols were pagans, where the Norse were pagans. What the fuck do they have in common other than they are not Abrahamic religions? Because that's the problem with this definition of paganism. It implies that the definition of paganism is anything that is not Abrahamic religions. Well, that is 99% of every form of spirituality and belief system ever devised by humankind outside of the Abrahamic religions. You're dealing with such a broad spectrum of cultures and beliefs, and yet people shove them all together as if they're all the same thing. You can look at the Mongolians and predict how the Norse would have been like because they're both pagans. It's a disservice to the Mongolians. It's a disservice to Norse paganism. Each of them is an individual form of thinking that is worthy of being individualized and looked at its own thing, not put into a basket of some vague thing called paganism. And, you know, they're all pagans, so whatever. If they had throat singing, we can assume the Norse also had it because it's basically the same thing. No, absolutely not. This is, I think, it betrays an extremely Abraham religion centric view of things that I'm absolutely opposed to. You can see a lot of bias there. I always use this example to convey to people what paganism is, because if you're using paganism in the sense of anything that is not Abrahamic religions, well, then pagan music is this. You want to know what pagan architecture looks like? It looks like this. That's pagan architecture technically, because the basic precepts of this kind of architecture go back to Greco-Roman architecture, which was a pagan civilization, right? That's the funny thing. Nowadays, when people think pagan, they think of a specific set of aesthetics popularized in pop culture, and they think that's what paganism is, but this is as much paganism as this. Paganism doesn't mean anything when used with that broad of a definition. But my point is this argument that we can safely assume that it's a high likelihood that they had Norse throat singing because they were pagans is such an incredibly flawed argument that no. So there's actually this commenter that offered a disagreement in a very critical and polite way so the other commenters can learn from them. They said, though I agree with the basis of what you're saying, throat singing is found in a lot of cultures from Africa, Italy to Mongolia, so thinking Vikings had throat singing isn't reaching all that far. It's the same as thinking they had drums, because pretty much every other culture has drums. Okay, so they're actually bringing up a very good point, which is that in ethnomusicology, you do not always need direct evidence to assume something existed. Some people on the comments of the previous video have said, well, you're saying we don't have evidence for them throat singing. We don't have evidence for them whistling either. They think they're so clever. Here's the thing. In ethnomusicology, indeed, you look at global ethnographic examples and you come up with high statistical occurrences when it comes to music. And certain things are so universally distributed in human behavior, musically speaking, that you can simply indeed assume that they just existed without needing to have direct evidence of them. This is why, for example, I'm saying if you want to assume that the Norse clapped to the beat of the music, sure, you can assume that that's not reaching all that far. The problem is equating throat singing with drums or with flutes or with clapping or with whistling is an extreme case of false equivalence. This is a argument that I see everywhere where people are saying, well, it appeared in a lot of cultures all around the world. It is a really exaggerated statement. And I think the way that it's worded, I'm not saying this person is trying to be, intentionally, intellectually dishonest, because clearly they're not, you can tell. But some people I've seen are trying to be sort of, to push this idea that it's a high likelihood of possibility. It's not reaching all that far, and they say, well, it's everywhere around the world. It's not everywhere around the world. Throat singing has occurred globally in extremely limited pockets of emergence. You find it in the musical continuum of Mongolia, the Altai, etc., which, yes, is a large geographical region, but it is in all the same musical system. These are not independent developments, independent from one another. They certainly have a common root. And then there's one emergence in the south of Africa, in certain tribes, and then there's one emergence in Sardinia specifically. See, saying Italy is a little misleading. Not really Italy, just Sardinia. So when we word it this way, it's found in a lot of cultures across Africa and Mongolia and Italy, you get a picture that would look like this, but a more accurate picture is actually this. And yeah, when you look at this, you see that, no, it's actually very limited pockets of emergence. It's absolutely not all around the world and everywhere. It's far from it. It's overtone throat singing is a statistical outlier in the musical traditions of humankind. It is absolutely not something that is found in a lot of cultures. It is not found anywhere. And for anybody who wants to say the Native Americans have throat singing, I have an entire video completely debunking this claim. There are no Native Americans anywhere in the Americas that have a singing technique that is anything like the overtone throat singing that we're talking about here. You can go watch that video for more explanation. So no, it is absolutely a stretch to assume that the Norse, we can't just assume they had throat singing. There is a high burden of proof here. Some things are too specific and rare in their statistical occurrences to just assume the Norse had throat singing is an absolute stretch. So I love this one. I don't see why they couldn't have had it. Hell, maybe not all tribes groups did it or knew how, but honestly, throat singing isn't very hard to do, and many people have probably done it on accident when imitating sounds they hear, but lack the vocal technique knowledge to do it on cue. Every human, well, barring injuries, birth defects, etc., has the capability to throat sing and sing traditionally. There's no reason to think they couldn't have tribes known for it. Would it sound just like Mongolian throat singing? No, for one, they didn't and still don't speak even remotely the same language, so yes, it's going to sound different. This video has so much unnecessary and often condescending bits to it that it's irking me as I continue on. Yes, my actual initials are CC for condescending cunt. Yeah, so here's the thing. A lot of people responded with that kind of anger and frustration, saying, well, it's not impossible, it's not impossible, it's not impossible. When have I ever said that it's impossible? But the problem is because there's some people who are so desperate, oh no, the other person is going to be like, of course it's not impossible, but it's not impossible is not a counter argument to the lack of evidence for throat singing in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Sure, it's not impossible. Now apply the same logic to the Romans or to the ancient Greeks. Why couldn't they have had throat singing? And yet you would never argue for that in favor of the ancient Romans and the Greeks. The only reason you defend it in the first place for the Norse is because pop culture myths have normalized the idea for you to the point where you feel the need to defend it. But if the only argument is, I don't see why they couldn't have had it, then you are obliged to apply the same logic to every historical culture ever. Again, scientific methodology doesn't work in a way where you can just cherry pick which culture you like and just put it to that culture. If the argument is it's not impossible, guess what? That applies to the Romans and the Greeks. And yet, are you here advocating for us to, as I say here, should we now start performing reconstructed Iliad performances with Khargira throat singing just because I don't see why they couldn't have had it? Anyone can perform throat singing. It's not just that there's no evidence for throat singing. It's that it's not even a hypothesis. It's not even a theory. And that's what I think the underlying problem with the previous comment. They said I'm on the fence about the subject. Well, now we're coming back to the thing that I was mentioning earlier. There is no fence. Because there is no fence to be sitting on, because there is no discussion going on. This is not a theory that some people are advocating for and some people are advocating against. This is not a hypothesis. People's idea right now is it's just a hypothesis. My God, calm down. Why are you so trying to debunk it so much? That's the problem. People think that right now in Norse studies, there's this entire body of Norse studies where you have academics left and right debating whether or not there's throat. No such thing is occurring. The Norse having throat singing is not a hypothesis any more than the idea of did the Greeks have throat singing, did the Romans have throat singing, did the Sumerians have throat singing. Mr. Scientific Method, yes, Mr. Internet Commenter Method. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, what is the current academic consensus on the yodeling theory for the Norse? The what? The yodeling theory, right? You know, what is the consensus that the academics have on the yodeling theory? I'm sorry, what do you mean the yodeling theory? The theory that they had yodeling and the subsequent discussion that is going on around it. I'm sorry, because I'm a little confused. Your question seems to have this pre-built implication or premise that there is a theory about whether the Norse had yodeling or not, as if it's a question that we're asking and actively working on. There isn't one. What do you mean there isn't one? Well, why would we ask that question in the first place? It's a very random... Like, why would we just go, did they have yodeling? It's not impossible. It's not impossible. Like, any human can perform it. It's like barring birth defects or injuries. It's not impossible. I don't see why they couldn't have had it. Oh my God. It's fucking condescending. So... In the mind of the pseudoscientific methodologist, any random idea that is not impossible to prove is a hypothesis. I think a lot of people don't understand how a hypothesis is formed in the first place. See, evidence is not only required in order to prove a hypothesis, evidence is required in order to postulate a hypothesis in the first place. Right, because I think that's the dividing line. That may even be the main dividing line between the pseudoscientific way of thinking and the scientific way of thinking. In pseudoscientific thinking, any random idea that is technically not impossible to prove, any negative that can't be proven, is automatically a hypothesis. And yet, technically, philosophically, it is a hypothesis, but we have to distinguish a philosophical hypothesis from an actual academic or scientific hypothesis. A hypothesis happens when you actually look at the reality that you're studying and you start to see certain elements pointing possibly towards the same direction, and you don't have enough evidence to prove it conclusively, but that's when you formulate a hypothesis. But that's not what happened with Norse throat singing. It's not a case of ethnomusicologists looking at the ethnographic evidence of Scandinavian music and then finding loads of indications going towards it and then postulating a hypothesis out of this. Nobody 20 years ago or 30 years ago was looking at this description by Ibn Yaqub and going, must be overtone throat singing. It may have been one of the 15 or 20 or 100 possibilities that they contemplated, but ultimately nobody thought throat singing with this text until those bands came along. See, a lot of people are under the impression that the idea of the Norse having throat singing is a hypothesis that grew out of scientific analysis of the Norse culture itself. No, it's an idea that grew out of pop cultural influence. Mr. Scientific Methodology, yes? What is the theory regarding the presence of buttegere in Norse culture? What is buttegere? Buttegere is that motif that is found in many countries such as Kazakhstan, Iran, Turkey, etc. There's no theory surrounding it. Why wouldn't there be a theory surrounding it? It's not impossible. I don't see why they couldn't have had it. Why wouldn't I don't see why they couldn't have had it. What is the consensus surrounding the hypothesis and theory of the Norse singing like the Islamic call to prayer? What do you mean hypothesis? Well, it's a hypothesis. It's not impossible. It's not impossible that it existed. Why couldn't they have had it? So it's a hypothesis. That's not how it works. What is the hypothesis surrounding the idea that they dabbed? What do you mean that they dabbed? Well, it's not impossible. It's just a simple gesture. Are you saying that in the entirety of human history, no one else ever did that? Is that literally impossible? I don't see why they couldn't have done this. This is not how it works. That's not how it works. The asking of this idea that the Norse have throat singing is a hypothesis, then so is it for the Romans. Why? It's not impossible. You can apply the same logic. I don't see why they couldn't have it. Any other humans can do it. And then people will say, well, the Norse were pagans, well, so the Romans, I hate to break it to you, they were pagans. They also had animistic elements in their culture that were highly animistic in many ways. What's even more interesting about the Romans, the only place in Europe where throat singing is known to exist and known to have ever existed is Sardinia. Sardinia is an island that is now part of Italy, as in the state. Sardinia, the language Sardinian, is the closest to Latin out of all the Romance languages. They still utilize vocal techniques that are the exact same as the liturgical forms of singing of the late Roman Empire in antiquity called Old Roman chanting. And they still use the launedas, which are pretty much the exact continuation of the Greco-Roman aulos, an instrument that is pretty much dead in the rest of the Mediterranean. So given those facts, why wouldn't it be a hypothesis? Why is it any less logical to entertain the idea, why shouldn't Romans have throat singing? And yet nobody ever entertains that idea. These very same people, if tomorrow I were to produce an epic Roman piece of music, like Legions of Caesar, and it starts with a morinchur fiddle, and it's like, it's about Caesar. Those very same people would be up in arms. What is this? You're destroying my immersion. What the fuck does this have to do with the Romans? The first question that people would ask is, why are you using throat singing? And I'd be like, why not? And they'd be like, it's so random. And I'd be like, it's not impossible. It's not impossible that they had throat singing. How can you prove that they didn't have throat singing? Any human can do it. And then you go over all these arguments, right? And then it doesn't end there. Why throat singing? Why not other vocal techniques? Suppose that tomorrow I were to release a song called Epic Norse Viking Music. And it has Islamic call to prayer style. Again, people will be up in arms. They'd say, what the fuck is this? Why are you using this? And I'd be saying, well, we don't know exactly what why not? It's not impossible. It's not impossible for them to have sang like this. And oh, by the way, what's funny? The Norse, they were never in contact with any culture that we know of that had throat singing. However, they were in frequent contact with Arab Muslims. So between the two, that is actually far more. But here again lies the problem for me. The problem is the hypocrisy. You have this group of people whose sole interest is in legitimizing nothing more than a man-child fantasy. They can't accept that, yeah, throat singing sounds cool for Wardruna, keep it there. It's Wardruna, it's modern music, it's Norse-themed music. That's cool, we can have fun this way. They need to go the extra mile and say no. It's a serious possibility that must be seriously considered. No, it must not be seriously considered any more than the idea, did the Sumerians have throat singing? Do you deem that worthy of serious consideration? I doubt that. I doubt that anybody has ever walked around saying we must seriously consider the idea that the Anglo-Saxons had throat singing. It's this pseudo-intellectual attitude that really is a disguise, because what lies at the heart of it, the truth of it, is this childish pursuit to desperately want to legitimize a man-child fantasy of, no, the Norse had to be these fucking awesome guys with two double axes, and they fucking 360 no-scoped all the Anglo-Saxons, and they went throat singing because they're so badass and they were berserkers. So here's the deal with me. Here's the deal. Do you want me to have a discussion with you about the possibility that the Norse may have had throat singing and seriously consider it? I will have that discussion with you, but on one condition. Then we're gonna sit the fuck down and we're gonna do the same thing for every other culture that has the same applicable factors, which is, it's not impossible, it emerged independently in other places, therefore why not? So based on this why not logic, we're going to sit the fuck down, and after we're done with the Norse, we're going to apply the same level of passion and serious consideration to the Anglo-Saxons, to the Franks, early Venetians of the early Middle Ages, because we don't know about their music, to the Romans, the ancient Greeks, the Persians, the Achaemenids, the Sasanians, the Aztecs, the ancient Japanese, etc., 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 etc. And we're going to have to run the whole gambit. And you better show the exact same, that's what I would say to the person who's so in love, with this idea. You better show the exact same amount of passion. If I just for 1 second sense in your body language that you're not as interested in the possibility of the Hittites having it or the Sumerians having it, then yeah, I'm going to end it there, because I will know that this is entirely pop cultural, and who am I kidding? We all know. The only reason for it is pop cultural. You don't get, with scientific methodology, to cherry pick the one outcome that you want just because it's so fucking cool and badass, and that's what I like from pop culture. That is not. I'm so sassy. I'm going like this. And I am, after all, condescending cunt. If we are to seriously consider this specific configuration, which is Norse plus throat singing, then you have to as seriously consider Norse plus every other vocal technique that is not impossible, that I don't see why they couldn't have had it, and then repeat the same list of limitless vocal techniques that we don't see why they couldn't have had it with every other conceivable culture that has ever existed across humankind. There was some Roman accounts of Gauls using some sort of growling vocals during rituals. Now, whether this was, see, again, now we're dealing with, what I was talking about, the Tacitus account, it was not the Gauls, it was the Germans. Again, you have people just saying there was some account. They're not actually checking their sources. They're not actually looking at the text. They heard something somewhere and they're just throwing it out there. At the same time, you saying no isn't accurate either. Far too much of that history is lost, especially after the Roman conquest of Gaul. Well, again, it's not the Gauls and everything, but at the same time, you saying no, why is it so difficult for people to simply say, I don't know? And I give them a few timestamps in the video where I literally say, we don't know, and it could be throat singing. Again, I say in the video it could be throat singing among a myriad of other things. But see, the problem with this why can't you say I don't know argument is that it's extremely manipulative. This is essentially comparable to me in my ancient Greek and Roman video talking about ancient Greek and Roman music, and I go, oh, they had the aulos, they had the lyre, they had the enharmonic modes and the chromatic modes, and we don't know if they had black metal vocals. We don't know that they didn't have those. We just don't know. It's super manipulative. It's like don't think about elephants. What do you think about? Elephants. And then you can't say, no, I didn't want you to think about elephants. That's why I said don't think about it. No, you're being manipulative. But now I'm causing people to specifically focus on death metal vocals and not on other types of vocals. The only way to do this fairly would be to also mention all the other vocal techniques that are technically not impossible. But that's just not practical. That's what I think a lot of people are missing when it comes to this discussion. The idea of the Norse having throat singing, entertaining this idea, did not originate out of the historical scientific studies of the Norse. It originated in the modern day through pop cultural. Do you know something else that had the exact same origins? Vikings wearing horn helmets. Right, this is the irony for me, because the very same people today who readily think that the Norse having throat singing is a serious hypothesis that must be considered, they see horn helmets in media. They didn't have horn helmets. They didn't have horn helmets. People love to point that out nowadays. And again, you refer back to my initial mental gymnastics example at the beginning of the video. We're going back to this now. Maybe we just didn't find evidence of the horn helmets yet. Just because you didn't find evidence doesn't mean that they didn't have horn helmets. There were other cultures of the area that had horn helmets. So why are you saying that it's a myth? Why are you trying to debunk it? But now it's throat singing. Throat singing is essentially the horn helmets of our day and age. We don't get to judge the 19th century Wagnerian aesthetic and go, ha ha ha, opera, horn helmets. We're no better. And this is really where the insanity, if you will, of the whole discussion really becomes clear. What some people believe to be a hypothesis that needs and requires serious consideration is a modern idea that modern people came up with that has no roots in observation of the actual Norse culture. And what people are now saying is maybe there is some cosmic probability that this random idea that some people came up with today may actually have occurred in the past. And therefore we should take this cosmic fucking probability as a serious hypothesis and seriously consider it. And the ultimate irony is this kind of demographic, if they had lived 200 years ago, they would be defending the idea of Vikings having horn helmets. They would fall in love with the idea and they wouldn't want to give up on it because they think it's so cool. And when a historian says there's no evidence for them wearing horn helmets, their response would be, you have to say, we don't know that they don't have horn helmets. We just don't know. It's a possibility. They would be saying the same thing 200 years ago, which is really where the irony lies. This is the main difference between an honest approach to Ibn Yaqub's passage and an approach that is clearly influenced by pop culture. The honest approach is to say, we don't know what it is. The intellectually dishonest approach is to say, we don't know that it's not throat singing. That being said, I'd love to have a rendition of the Iliad with Khargira, and I answer, Iliad is sung with Khargira once, it catches on, it becomes a trend. 10 years later, every instance of the Iliad in pop culture comes with Khargira. Historians point out how there's no evidence for Khargira in Greek antiquity. Fans who are now used to the trend get angry at the historians and say, well, I don't see why they couldn't have had it. The circle is complete. And if it sounds weird to you, if you think to yourself, come on, that's ridiculous. Ancient Greek throat singing, well, welcome to the club. Now you know how it feels when you have the Norse throat singing. Now you've taken the step back in order to see things with a broader context. We really allow pop culture to play with us and direct how we look at history. And we shouldn't. I think it's not as obvious as we may think. We may think that it's very obvious, but really the effect that pop culture has on our brains is far more insidious than we think it to be. And it often takes shape with extremely subtle forms of cognitive bias and logical fallacies that are very subtle for us to notice in the first place. But if you really take a step back, you realize that, whoa, we're really brainwashed by pop culture. Just the fact that a massive amount of the audience out there has no problem listening to throat singing for the Norse, but the moment I would apply it to the Anglo-Saxons or to the ancient Greeks, these very same people would just, bite into me and say, this is so random, what is this? It shows just how deeply we are conditioned to think by pop culture. Anyway, I hope you've liked this video. This is Farya Faraji, and if you've liked this video, then you're probably already subscribed to me. So please subscribe and like. I don't say that. Just do whatever you want. You're free. You're free. Do whatever you want. If you want, if you still want to some people are still going, you fucking idiot. They have throat singing. If you want to write that, I don't care. Do whatever you want. You don't have to. I don't care. Goodbye.